Do you need to take a methylated B? Are you methylating? Yes, you are. Are you under methylating or are you over methylating?
Ah!
Answer some questions today about methylation. So we hear people being told that everybody needs to get their MTHFR tested, their genetic marker for it, that everybody should be taking a methylated vitamin, and that you're going to die if you don't methylate right now. But I promise you, you'd be dead right now if you weren't methylating. So,
Yeah.
we got a list of questions here that we're going to dive into, but we got the expert here, Dr. V, who has taught me more about methylation than a whole stack of books that are usually behind me. So
Yeah.
why don't we start with the obvious? What is it and why is it important? And why is everybody
Right.
talking about it?
It's such a key pathway, and I almost think of it as an organ unto itself. It
Right.
is one of the seven phase two liver detoxification pathways, but it's so profoundly relevant to so many different things. If we're not methylating properly, we homocysteine levels can go up. We have cardiovascular problems. If we're under methylating, girls, if you're under methylating, you're going to have estrogen dominant symptoms because it's a key pathway for estrogen to metabolize. So, I mean, those are a big old bummers. MAO inhibitors, dopamine-based medications. Methylation is the key pathway to break down dopamine. If we're not breaking down dopamine, then that's schizophrenia. If we're breaking it down too fast and we have low dopamine, that's depression, malaise, Parkinson's. So, I mean, we're talking massive problems if this pathway is not functioning right. A lot
Long-term
of
and
people,
short-term, right? It could be the difference
long-term and
between
short-term,
long-term
right?
problems or being able to sleep at night. You need
Right.
to,
Or nightmares tonight if you're not methylating tonight.
right. Yeah.
Yeah. And then
Okay.
then we can throw COVID into the equation as well. I just kind of did the whole summary for the seminar, for the workshop just now. But I mean, COVID is a retrovirus that compromises methylation. So, I mean, we've got, so when we were talking about toxic metals and cortisol and all the other things that can compromise methylation. But just to give you that, there's your cliff notes of what we're about to talk about because
A
it's
little bit of
massive,
everything.
right?
Yeah. It's
And that's
important.
why, yeah, that's why it's so important because it can affect. I mean, it's the same pathway, but yet are you going to end up with a cardiovascular, heart attack, or you're going
Yeah.
to be a schizophrenic? You're going to be a, crazy wife with, estrogen dominance.
Or a crazy man with estrogen dominance, which happens all the
Right,
time too.
right, that
So,
too.
how do you know? What are some of the most obvious reasons that you would say you might not be methylating, right? Without having
Yeah,
to get a genetic test, right, to see if you've got
right.
this MTHFR.
Right. And so if homocysteine is not, so methylation and sulfation are two of those phase two detox pathways. When they don't function properly, then homocysteine doesn't get recycled and broken down properly. If we're not breaking down homocysteine appropriately, that is directly related to cardiovascular problem, plaquing of the arteries, a physical sign of undermethylating of high homocysteine is these red dots, petechiae or cherry angiomas.
Right.
So if you are one of those people, very common people that have the little red dots, or if they're, God forbid, mole size, the raised, that typically means you have cardiovascular risk in your family. Mom, dad, I was teaching this 20 some odd years ago to a group when I was teaching a liver detox pathway or liver detox conference. And, this gal says like this, shows me, appropriately her cleavage, and she had a big old mole. And I said, you have this, you have problems there. Tell me about your parents. Mom and dad both died in their 40s of cardiovascular problems.
And also, I
So,
mean, Dr. Chi would teach that that's an estrogen dominant situation as well, because there's that methylation piece in there for the estrogen too.
right.
And
So
I know
same
that
pathway.
for people who aren't familiar with homocysteine, what homocysteine is, it is one of those cardiovascular risk tests that you can do a blood test on to see if
Mhm.
you are have too high. If it is too high, as Dr. V was just saying, it can create more problems that lead to more cardiovascular risk. It can really start to tear down your vasculature, and you can make that homocysteine go to be something that helps you if you have the right nutrients in your body. It can actually be made into something called glutathione, which is your master antioxidant. Or it could also get turned back into something called methionine, which is one of the most important amino acids in your body. And so, in fact, some people call
Mhm.
methionine a methylated homocysteine because you can actually convert it. So it is important for cardiovascular health. But what about something more direct, more obvious, like somebody may be feeling on a day-to-day basis? without the red dots to make
Right, right. So on the labs, we want the homocysteine levels to be, depends on who you ask, below 9.5 is what originally 10, 20 years ago, we were saying 11.5. Numbers come down to 9.5. A lot of people are now saying under 7.5 even.
okay.
So truly healthy people are going to be in the low single digits like that. So if you're, and it's a pretty reasonable test. And the reason it's not, I mean, it is directly related to cardiovascular problems. Cardiovascular surgeons, like the podcast I just got off of, they know that homocysteine is a risk factor, and it's more directly related to cardiovascular risk than cholesterol is. But there's no drugs to lower it. So that's why nobody talks about it, because there's no big pharma dollar behind it right now. The
Right.
main nutrient to reduce homocysteine, I mean, you just kind of open the door on all the pathway, but
Yeah.
B6 is the main, a good B6 supplement, foods that are high in B6, but B6 is the main nutrient to drive that pathway. We've also got zinc and, all these other B12 things that are going to drive the breaking down of homocysteine. But those are the supplements that you might want to look at if you've been found out that your homocysteine levels are high. So other symptoms, other signs or symptoms that you might not be methylating properly. If orange cheese can function as an MAO inhibitor, which can cause high dopamine. So if a person's eating cheese, especially in the evening, then they're going to wake up with nightmares, night terrors, vivid dreams like that. So, so orange cheese, that's going to be a tonight symptom of that you have compromised methylation, and you're going to if you keep doing it, potentially, be in a straitjacket.
Yeah.
Schizophrenic.
And another one that I think a lot of people don't realize is that maybe even simpler is your histamine response, right? If you have a ton of
Okay.
histamine and you're
Mhm.
always taking antihistamines because you just can't get rid of them, you are likely a low methylator because you
Mhm.
need that methyl donor from the methylation process to help you eliminate histamine. In fact, that's why Dr. Walsh, like he says, that's his favorite test to determine if somebody's methylating well or not, is actually just checking whole blood histamine. So
Okay.
for you
Mhm.
watching, if you never have any histamine problems, if you never have any allergies, you may be in that category that I think is even more concerning, that you're over methylating versus
Mhm.
somebody who's under methylating. And that's another big point we want to point out, is that they talk all about just under methylating, but over methylating is possibly the same percentage. Well, it's the same, amount of people that are struggling with that, and it's actually probably even more dangerous.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
I mean, another thing that people may not realize is that you need methylation to convert serotonin into melatonin to help you sleep at night, right? So that could
Mhm. Mhm.
another problem. Reason that you're not sleeping at night could be low methylation as well. So
Right.
now you were saying something earlier about vitamin B, and sometimes when people take a bunch of synthetic vitamin Bs, it actually creates more problems. And that's one of the questions
Right.
I think that people should know, right?
Right. So if they take I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, a cheap
This
B6
company,
supplement.
right?
So yeah, pyridoxal hydrochloride, or diamond hydrochloride, or one of these that's, we'll just call it a cheap form of the B vitamin there's pathways in the liver that have to activate that and make it the pyridoxal 5-phosphate if we're taking the inactive form of that vitamin. And so those vitamins require more energy to activate them, to create a entity that the body can use to drive methylation, to keep the blood flowing properly, to keep the heart contracting efficiently. So one of the typical places I see, if somebody's taking a cheap B vitamin, a multi B complex, anti-stress pill, or a typical daily vitamin with the whole lot of the vitamins, typically they're pretty low quality forms of those B vitamins, and it will show up as anxiety. It will show up as a stressor on the heart, which causes that left shoulder to roll forward. They're going to have tension in the back of the upper trap on the left side, maybe even pain down the arm, God forbid, and that's always a big alarm. But
Right.
typically they're just going to have that generalized anxiety if they're taking if they're taking a B complex, just trying to keep their stress handled, right?
Yeah, yeah, and that's stress. What's funny you should say stress, because the stress can actually be the difference between whether or not you're methylating appropriately or not, right? It's estimated, I think, like
Right.
30% of the Italian population is they have the genetic marker for being low methylator, but they don't have the symptomatic expression because they don't have the same amount of stress in their life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Specifically.
Mm-hmm.
So that is
Yeah.
something to make the difference between whether or not you actually need to be taking something to support it.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
You want to go into we can go into the things that can inhibit methylation, right? So we've
Definitely.
got
Yeah, I think that's important for people to realize that you should be aware that if you're doing too many things that are going to slow down your body's ability to methylate, then yeah, then you should be paying attention, especially if you're already predisposed to it. And
right.
I was not unhappy, actually kind of happy in a way to see on your list that caffeine is something that could inhibit methylation.
Mm. Yes. Fortunately, green tea, has caffeine, has a theanine in there, which seems to actually help, if you will, the methylation pathway. So
Huh.
caffeine itself, in rock stars, and I just threw somebody under the bus, but
There you go.
and in an energy drink or too much coffee or that, challenges like that, those can, and stress in general, right? Being in that chronic fight or flight mechanism, fight or flight scenario is going to chronically inhibit the methylation pathway too, and open Pandora's box, open the door for cancers. I mean, right?
Right.
I mean, people have got some very close friends right now that are dealing with that, massive stress over the whole last year, and fighting cancer, fighting the big monster right now
Right.
because of the way that it shuts down that detoxification pathway. And sometimes it can even upregulate the phase one pathway, which means we create all these free radicals that then phase two doesn't have the ability to deal with. And then that's a malignant type of cancers. That's where cells all over the body are starting to manipulate or change. So yeah, we've got stress is a big old bummer. Yeah, thyroid medications, unfortunately, thyroid medications tend to compromise folate metabolism and
Wow.
can then therefore inhibit the methylation pathway. So we want to be very careful on thyroid medications. Um, Hormones, right? If the person is taking a birth control pill, the synthetic hormones are going to have to go through the methylation pathway, glutathione, P450, glucuronidation, all those key pathways. And if so,
Yeah, you
sorry to
guys know
throw out
glucuronidation, right? Yeah, you're
so
in
if
our
those
next
paths,
video.
so if we're not breaking those hormones down properly, then there's issues with that, and that's why HRT or hormone therapy replacement therapy can be potentially catastrophic.
Right.
Symptoms of poor estrogen metabolism or poor, we talked about the red dots. Another physical sign is the brown dots, the age spots, and uh, some people will call them estrogen, poor estrogen metabolism. That is a sign of poor methylation as well.
Mm.
So if you're getting the browning of the skin or the brown polka dots, then that is a sign that you're not methylating properly. You want to be more intentional about getting your green leafies, getting your vegetables, folate sources, like the couple foods that you're about to tell us about, to help drive methylation, keep that pathway working properly.
Yeah, I mean, we always want to give people a whole food folate source, right? Not just because we want the whole food folate, but because all of the other cofactors that come with that are going to help facilitate methylation. Because you don't just need folate, you don't just
Mhm.
need vitamin B, you need a whole host of them. And I remember you had a slide in your seminar that said these are the things that facilitate methylation, and it's a long
Mhm.
list of nutrients, right? Probably like
Right.
20 of them on
Right,
there.
right.
So when you're eating whole foods, like you said, spinach or dark leafy green vegetables, beans are a good source of folate, and asparagus being one of my favorite go-tos for people. You are
Mhm.
delivering a whole host of these nutrients, and so you are making it a lot easier as opposed to taking one synthetic, isolated, methylated B that people are
Mhm.
able to take.
Right, right. And so since we're talking about methylation, B12 is a key. So folate is, very high in a lot of these plant sources, but B12 is said to only be in animal products, right? So B12 and iron and methionine. Methionine is only in beef, tuna, and eggs. These are key nutrients to drive the methylation pathway. So if somebody's listening to this podcast is a plant-based diet person trying to figure out how they're getting B12, there is good news that it has been recently discovered that the lactobacillus, the probiotic, that there's many different forms of lactobacillus. Those organisms actually make B12 within our body. So if we've got a good, healthy gut integrity, good functioning gut, eating the good fats to support the intestinal integrity and the good biota, the good bugs, then they should be making B12 B12 for us. So if you, and B12 can be tested, that's a very common test on in a functional med kind of a type, blood test.
Right.
So if you know that your B12 levels are low, do you have anemia symptoms? That's B12 helps with iron absorption, anemia. Um, then you might have a gut bacteria imbalance. You might need to look at rehabbing the good gut bacteria, which
Mm.
again means eating vegetables. I mean, blending them is even better potentially from trying to rebuild gut bacteria because blending them seems to be a little bit, in other words, so we still get the fiber because the fiber feeds the butyrate, which rebuilds that intestinal integrity, but it also is the building blocks. It's the soil for the healthy probiotics, the healthy bacteria. So we get those vegetables chew up our fiber and that sort of stuff. Then that's going to help make the lactobacillus organisms to help make B12. So there's
Yeah.
hope for those plant-based people. And then we can have the other philosophical discussion about the meat and all
Yeah, yeah.
that.
Well, I think bottom line is getting all the nutrients in there is going to be the answer instead of skipping steps as always and putting in something like this. In speaking of this, I just have a sidebar question on this. Now, I know some nutritionists and healthcare practitioners out there will say, well, you know what? If you've got a problem with it, take methyl sparing supplements, meaning they say take creatine because it takes a lot of methylation process for your body to make creatine, right? So skip that step and give yourself creatine, which we've talked about, right? We did a whole episode on this, that can actually save your body to be able to methylate in other places. That's an interesting theory, but I'm thinking if you need to take creatine to feel better, you're probably not methylating well. And the same
True
thing
story.
for melatonin, phosphatidylcholine would be another one, right? That'd be noted that all of these do also require that. So it's an interesting way to think about it that you could spare it by skipping, but I never like skipping steps in nature because nature always wins, and there's going to be something that you're gonna
Love that line.
Yeah.
There's a mic drop. Nature always wins. Dunk.
Right.
And so I was just listening to a podcast this afternoon talking about creatine, and that they alluded to a study that showed improved mental cognition, mental functioning by using creatine. But then that had me thinking of you and where you were kind of starting to go with that conversation. We need phosphorus to make ATP, and he was using this as justification for how relevant mitochondrial function is, for mental health, right? And so he was quoting a study where they gave people creatine and it helped lift depression, helped improve their mental cognition. But then I'm thinking, well, we better make sure those people have phosphorus if they're taking creatine, to facilitate methylation, to help the mitochondria function better, make energy.
And which is the whole reason we started this whole podcast in the first place is like we want to know why it's working, not just that it's working. Because if you just run with that it's working, it's not going to keep working all the time. You're going to miss the other things that are helping make it work. And so that's why I think it's interesting to note that about creatine being there has to be a methylation piece to make sure that our body can make its own creatine. And that's why there's so much popularity about that. It may be a big piece of it, maybe that people aren't supporting their body's ability to have enough methylation going on to create adequate amounts of creatine for themselves. It's just
Right.
about it, for sure.
So much out there.
Yeah. I was trying to think of the other things that you had on your list of things that facilitate some of
Toxic
the
metals.
well that inhibits, right? That'll
Yeah.
inhibit,
Oh,
right?
yes.
So arsenic, mercury, cadmium,
Yes.
right? Those are
Yes.
big inhibitors of
Right.
methylation.
Which is part of why those are big triggers for cancers, for example, right? Pesticides, most of those metals you just talked about, the cadmium, the arsenic, those are in pesticides that then, like glyphosate, right? Think of how many people have won millions, if not billions of dollars because of glyphosate using Roundup, in on their farm, and now their life has been compromised.
Right.
So I mean that's a big deal. So you were asking the nutrients. So B6, zinc,
Yep.
methionine,
Which is an amino acid. It's
B12.
a big one, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Probably the biggest really is B12, though. B12 is the primary
Really?
methyl donor for methionine, for
Okay.
methylation. So,
Okay. Interesting. I think of methionine as being exceedingly important just because the body recycles other things to make more methionine, and it's a part of almost every protein structure in the body. So yeah, I think and all the ones you named are ones that are commonly uh, underrepresented in people's daily diets, right?
Right, right, right. Our soils, zinc, our soils are deficient in zinc because they're over farmed and that sort of thing. So the minerals need to come from healthy soil.
Right.
And with traditional industrial, call it industrialized farming, with pesticides, with
Yeah.
not healthy soil, not rotated crops, then they end up very deficient in the soils. And so then the plants don't have the minerals that they need to be strong and healthy and vital. So then they have to use pesticides because the plants are weak and feeble.
Right. Right.
And then we try
Yeah.
to eat those to not be and think that we're not going to be weak and feeble eating these weak, feeble plants.
Right. Yeah.
So organic is cheaper than chemo. Dr. P's
There it is
favorite
again.
tagline.
Right. And you need those to help with the detoxification process of getting the metals out, right? So it's not just about,
Mhm.
like we talked last time, of reducing your exposure to those, but once you have them, you need the other nutrients to help your body to facilitate the removal from the body too,
Right.
right? That's where
Totally. Yes,
methylation comes
yes.
in a big,
Hmm.
big way.
Hmm.
So, in your opinion, I don't know if we're answering the questions people are looking for here, but I'm going to try to ask for sure. Do you think people should take a methylated B to if they're having any type of issues like
Right.
mental
So
health
offline, we
issues?
talked about the difference between A, B vitamin and B complex.
Right,
And so I
right,
was alluding to the fact most typically when I see patients come in with their cheap non-methylated B vitamins, then that's going to create anxiety, well, under functioning heart of all, unfortunately, of all things. Again, because the body has to convert those B vitamins. So for starters, in my opinion, B complex as a conglomerate of all the B vitamins doesn't tend to work well. The reality is each B vitamin has a different function, different form, different function in the body. So for us as clinicians, what is it? What does that person need? If they're under methylating, other symptoms of B12 deficiency is lack of flexibility because of the histamine aspect you were talking about. B12 helps break down that histamine in the pathway that you mentioned a couple minutes ago. If we're
right,
not breaking histamine down, then the fascia around the muscle is going to be tight. So you can have trouble, getting to touch the toes, or, flexibility is going to be poor. They're going to, because the fascia is tight, they're not going to get inspired and energized from exercise. They're going to feel more blown out from even doing yoga or stretching because that's actually a stressor for the body when a person is deficient in B12. So if we're dealing with symptoms like that, I may give a methylated B12, a methylcobalamin active form of B12 to get them out of that cycle. But we need to look at why are they B12 deficient? Are they not
right.
eating the foods that have it, the animal products that have B12, or do we need to get the gut bacteria repopulated to help them start then producing their own B12
So I think
from
we're in
the
agreement
collective
that
cells?
there can be a short-term application for these, but it should never be the long-term solution, right?
Yes. Hmm.
Because
Hmm.
it is an indication that something else is missing if you're having to give a synthetic form. And I think you're mainly talking about these synthetic multi, like with,
Yep.
10,000 of this and 15,000 that are just
Yeah.
the chemical derivatives that are in there and not the whole food source of them.
Right. And a good subject, a good example of this is when the MTHFR gene became real popular, 10 years ago or so. And I kind of jumped on the wagon like, oh, these, this, whatever they're saying, about half, 48% of the population or something is MTHFR compromised. And again, this was before COVID. The retrovirus of COVID can actually compromise the methylation pathway. Speaking of retroviruses, viruses can cause these gene mutations that people may be seeing on their on genetic markers. So viruses can cause those, and retrovirus like COVID can compromise the methylation pathway. So that's another subject. But back in the day when the MTHFR gene was popularized, I was testing against things like like a folate versus folic acid and that sort of stuff. And I see,
Right.
oh, people are getting weak to folic acid. They must have the MTHFR gene, right? And then I was, buying the different, the folate supplements and recommending those initially, and then came across a study, and then I started pondering, and then came across a study of that if people have this MTHFR gene and they can't metabolize folic acid and so on, I'm like, well, then why aren't they getting sick by eating vegetables, right? If they're
Right.
eating vegetables. So So it doesn't affect that way because it's in the form of folate. So if you know, if you as a listener know that you have an MTHFR gene, you need to be even more intentional, more careful about taking these synthetic forms of the B vitamins, folic acid, cheesy sources of B vitamins, because they're going to be an even bigger compromise for you. You want to make sure you're looking at methylcobalamin. If you are doing something along those lines, you want to look at good folate source, not folic acid, to facilitate these pathways because you're going to exaggerate your potential for cancer if you have the MTHFR gene and you're taking these synthetic sources of B vitamins.
Right. Yeah. Well, and you can take them for too long and create the opposite problem as well.
Deficiencies, you
So
can create
yeah,
functional deficiencies.
right,
Totally.
right.
Yep.
And in fact, when it comes to mental health, which is a lot what people talk about, I think that's where I get the most concerned because
Hmm.
the low folate biotype that Dr. Walsh talked about being the most at risk for suicidal and homicidal ideation when they're on an
Hmm.
antidepressant. And so if you are taking that methylated form of it, you can actually be, making a little bit of a challenge to that, right? You always want to get it the way that nature creates it. And if you put
Hmm.
something for too long, and a lot of times people feel great at first, right? Because they needed it. But then if they don't finish off with all the
Hmm.
cofactors, they hit that wall and then they have this absolute flip back, which is a terrible thing for them.
Yeah, and that's a great point. Yeah, I mean, listener, if you feel great on a vitamin and you're not doing well now, you could very well be creating the functional deficiency because the body's having to rob these other nutrients to metabolize it, right?
Right.
To, phosphorylate the B6, for example, B6, um, B6 pyridoxal hydro, what is it? P5P,
Might be,
pyridoxal
yeah, that's
P5 pyridoxal
I think
pyridox
P5 is good.
hydro anyway 5-phosphate pyridoxal
Yeah.
5-phosphate, yes. As the active form of B6 that requires a lot of phosphorus, right, to make it active. And so if
Right.
you're taking pyridoxal hydrochloride and then needing to use up all this phosphorus to do it, it might work for a little while, but then now you've got osteoporosis because you're stealing phosphorus from the bones to activate the pyridoxal hydrochloride that you're taking. So look at plant vitamins as they are in nature, as God originally made them, as God originally intended for starters. And secondarily, if you get the little kick, great, but figure out why, figure out what else you need, right?
Absolutely. And I guess that's the ultimate question. The takeaway here is if somebody does know that they're undermethylated, if they do know they have MTHFR, do they have to take a specific multivitamin to correct for that? Or can they do this with diet?
Do it with diet if you
Absolutely.
can, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Right.
if you can.
Yeah. So I mean
For
that's
sure.
eating your organic vegetables, your foods. You may need to reconsider whether, plant-based diet or more animal, more carnivore type diet. Some of that's going to be blood type dependent. Some of it's going to be dependent on your needs. Where have you been running deficiencies in your life?
Right.
Right.
And I think a bigger caution here is that I like to just bring up, since if anybody is listening about to this, that you shouldn't dictate your supplementation and your whole diet based on one genetic marker either.
Mhm. Mhm.
There are so many other things that are inhibiting it. Like we just talked about, like if you don't have the nutrients to facilitate it, it doesn't matter, right?
Mhm.
If you don't have the genes to support that, because if you're missing those nutrients, you're going to have a problem somewhere else, right?
Mhm.
You
Mhm.
just don't have enough zinc. It's not just going to affect methylation. It's going to affect tons of things in the body. Same with all these nutrients. And the other side of that is if you're not methylating because you have a heavy metal toxicity, it doesn't matter if
Mhm.
take a supplement to help you methylate, it'll help a little bit, but you still need to address that heavy metal exposure and toxicity, right? That
Yep.
one
Yeah.
little methylated thing based on one genetic marker isn't going to correct for all of the reasons that it's not working appropriately.
Mhm.
Did
Well,
I?
it'd be nice if it was that easy. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
I mean, it's part of the reason, a lot of the reason I didn't get crazy about gene testing, back
Right,
when it started becoming popular. It's like, the Human Genome Project that was like, they figured out, if we're going to figure out the gene, people's genes, we can say, you need to take this vitamin and that vitamin, and you're going to live happily live to be at 300 years old, and it
right,
didn't work. They looked at genes, they gave supplements based on their genome, their
right,
gene types, and it didn't change their worlds. And some people got worse. So there's
right.
so many other factors in there that are relevant. I mean, we have to. That's what makes doctoring so exciting, right? Is we have to take all those other factors into play. We need to look at what their diet is. We need to look at what their relationships in life are. How fulfilled are they in their work? You know,
Right.
what are they doing for activity? Are they moving? Are they sitting on the couch? And all these things play a different, affect what genes are being turned on and off, how they're functioning. It would be so nice. You and I's lives would be so much easier if we could just give everybody B6 or
Oh,
give everybody
right.
methylcobalamin and boom, I'm a hero. Aren't you feeling great? You know, right? It'd be nice if it was that easy.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And it's not. And that's just it, is I just want to caution anybody to let their whole lives be dictated by a genetic anything. And that's where
Hmm.
people fall into that category where they're like, oh, well, I have this genetically. And they'll always do this too. They'll say, well, my mom
Hmm.
and my distant aunt had it. So I'm
Hmm.
at
Hmm.
risk, you know. There's so
Hmm.
much more that you can do to influence the expression of those genes. And that's what
Right,
we're really talking about here.
right.
The crudest way I've heard it put is, genes may load the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger.
Yep.
Without these external forces working on that genes, it doesn't matter what the genes are necessarily, right? Most of the time.
Hmm.
Now, it is going to inform you as to where you need to focus on your weaknesses for sure. But
Hmm. Hmm.
I would not let it run my entire life by any means, or let
For
it
sure.
put me into the victim category, because
Hmm.
you're not a victim of your genes. There's something you can do, and you can learn
Hmm.
about it.
Hmm.
Oh,
Hmm. And I love that. We're talking about methylation because this is the key pathway for epigenetics, keeping
yeah,
this pathway functioning better so that those bad genes are not manifesting, right? But along what you're saying, if the listener has done gene testing and has been told that they have, sulfation problems or methylation problems, rather than be defeated, be empowered. Be okay.
right.
I have this extra incentive to make better choices in my life. Person comes back says, "Oh, my genes are perfect. I can eat donuts for life." That's not helping them so much. But use the knowledge, the information that the genetic testing does to help inspire you to be more committed to making healthy, proper choices to maximize your life and thrive and flourish. Instead of somebody that used to be very I can't somebody I knew had a lot of had family history of cardiovascular problems and brother parents all that sort of stuff, and they just took it like it is what it is. I'm going to be disabled at some point. I'm going to have a heart attack, and they'd had 4 stints by this point, and doing all that stuff and just writing it off like this is my destiny, and not doing anything to turn it around. Whereas the inspired, the wise person might say, should say, "Oh
Right.
man, mom, dad, my brother, they've all had this issue. What do I need to do to not go that route?" I mean, that's
Yeah.
that's where I took it when I was stinking 14 years old. I watched grandpa die. I'm like, what do I need to do? I don't want to go that way.
Right.
You
Well,
know?
when people say to me that they've gotten it in their family, I said, yeah, you're an American. It's the number one thing that kills everybody. So
Right.
everybody has it in their family, right? Don't let that
Right.
reason it's going to happen to you is because it was,
Hmm.
it's all of the choices that we make as combined that are contributing to that for sure.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm.
And you can do about it, right? You said empower yourself with that for sure.
Oh,
Yeah.
right.
But
It's not a death sentence. It's an empowering statement.
right. And so when people hear, I mean, there's a lot of very influential people out there saying things like everybody should get their MTHFR tested at least once and then live
Hmm.
based on that. I just have to disagree with that. And I would have to say that I don't think that that ultimately is going to bring balance to your life and help
Hmm.
you really know what's being supported in your life. Because there could be other genes that aren't being tested that could be negating that, right? And doing
Hmm.
it the way
Hmm.
around. So
Compensating. Hmm.
don't let one little thing make that decision for you. And they're also saying things like everybody should take a pre-methylated B. And I absolutely disagree with that because we have far too many things that are influencing our health and our genetic expressions, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
To say that can be dangerous for some people. So yeah, go back to nature and just be very careful, right? And make sure that you're getting all the nutrients and removing those things that are inhibiting it, and seek somebody, who can help you understand where you're at in that. And some of the
Hmm.
ways you can do that is, like you said, check your homocysteine, check your histamine, or muscle tests. So you have a whole point on your muscle testing chart that's
Hmm.
specific to methylation, right? Are you able
Yes.
to help us see that?
Yeah. Will it focus back there? Try to get my camera to focus.
There you
Um,
go.
but basically, it's going to be over the liver. Let me try to bring the camera down. I'll show you my liver here. Camera's hot. Wow. So basically, if you put your left hand over the bottom of your rib cage, right where your knuckle is. Basically, it's going to be just at the bottom of the broad line there. That is a methylation point. So that's part of how I got to know all these things back in the early days of testing like this, functional testing. There was they'd use challenge substances. If you give a person, caffeine, they give them NSAIDs and acetaminophen and measure the clearance, the elimination of these products to determine how underfunctioning these pathways were. A lot of this came from, fortunately, from drug companies that were trying to see how their medications were metabolized. So I used those challenge substances to figure out where these referred pain areas were. They all ended up being right over the liver. So basically, the liver is, if you put your left hand over the bottom of the rib cage
There
there,
you go. You got it.
that's your liver
Huh?
on the right side. And so right in the middle of that is the methylation pathway, the fingertips, where the elbow reaches the side. That's the first phase of detoxification. That pathway is called P450, cytochrome P450. And so then they go on from there over to acetylation, which is kind of almost to the sternum. And so, yeah, right in the middle of that is methylation, and that's a pathway that'll be tender. It'll be functionally tender if you, drank mercury and it stressed the liver pathway, the methylation pathway, then it's going to be very tender there. If your coffee's compromised in that pathway, then it'll be tender there. If you take a B12 supplement or you eat beef or vegetables that help facilitate that pathway, then it's going to get less tender. So then you can know immediately whether or not that food, that product is helping you.
Nice, nice. What do you find? You said you think when it's hypo working, when you muscle test that, most
Mhm.
of the time it's a lack of B12, would you say, in your experience, or is that just one of the
That
top?
is B12 is the most common methyl donor for that pathway. Yes. We need to look at is it a medication? Is it a toxic metal? Is it stress, that's compromising it? The conundrum, I mean, sulfation, if sulfation is not, if there's some there's some bacteria, parasites, and viruses that can inhibit the sulfation pathway. So then they don't break cortisol down properly, and then cortisol can inhibit methylation. So that's the dog chasing its tail kind of, conundrum that can happen.
Yeah.
So I mean that happens, but yeah, typically when methylation is not functioning, is it because you're is doing medications that compromise it, toxic metals, or do we just simply need B12 or B6? That's another one. B6, I'm more commonly looking at when there's mental emotional symptoms, dopamine compromise, or high dopamine, low dopamine symptoms. Low dopamine's Parkinson's, high dopamine schizophrenia, and then leading up to those are the pathologic examples of high dopamine or low dopamine. But then nightmares is the not quite pathologic example of high dopamine. So we got all that, resting, paradoxical tremors and, that sort of stuff. Those are all, prior to Parkinson's that we want to start making changes, use those as the early signs, early warnings that the pathway is not working right. As well as the brown spots, the red spots, red dots, things that could be an early warning sign that those pathways are not functioning right. So,
Yeah. And I mean, and not to overwhelm everybody, right? It gets complicated. But I mean, the more you're eating whole foods that have all of these, the less likely you're going to fall into that category.
right.
You really want to be getting them the way that they're balanced in nature for you. So I just
Mhm.
caution against trying to supplement your way out of that as well.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
Um,
So the consideration when you're looking at, whether it's going to be good or not is remember that anything God made is better than everything man made.
right. Oh
Right?
yeah.
So if
Look at
God made it,
that.
it's
Another
probably going to
little
work.
soundbite there. Yeah, you got yourself a little TikTok reel there. Hey, I'm going to have one last question for you, but do you have
Oh,
anything else that you want to say about methylation that you think everybody needs to know?
uh, I think we covered a lot of the heavy hitters for it. Yeah.
Yeah. So when it comes to genetic mutations, right? Like
Okay.
they talk about this being a single, a SNP, right? A single
Snip.
nucleotide.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And so that means it's mutated. Do you believe it's possible that that mutation can unmutate and become?
You wanted to, yeah. So you know where I stand on this.
Well, I don't think a lot of people know
Yeah,
this, though. I think
yeah,
it's
yeah.
worth asking the question.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, I got into this. I mean, this question really came so where it started was back in the MTHFR gene days when that became a very popular SNP and a problem. Dr. Klinghardt was testing all his patients on these gene issues. And you talked about the single and double nuclear, the homozygous or heterozygous, meaning, okay, if it's homozygous, that means both parents had the MTHFR gene. And so he tested a child, a young lad that had homozygous, meaning both parents had to have the MTHFR gene. So, okay, well, let's test your parents. Let's just make sure. Tested both parents, and neither parent had the gene. But
Ah,
yet the gene testing showed that both parents were right. Whoa, how could this happen? Right.
great.
So that just opened for me. I mean, I already was kind of thinking along these lines. So in his muscle testing, in his testing, he was able to identify that retroviruses compromised the way the methylation gene was functioning. So this kid had some kind of a retrovirus. Now COVID is a very popular one. This was pre-COVID that I learned this and I got exposed to it. But COVID is very common. HPV, hemopapillovirus, that gals unfortunately can be compromised by. These are viruses that can compromise that methylation pathway and then show up as a gene deficiency, gene function. So then the mind blown part that I'm still trying to find research to confirm or prove is, can't we treat that virus? Can't we reduce the functioning, the virality of that virus and reverse that gene mutation? I think it's possible. God can do, all things are possible through He who strengthens us.
I think that's going to be a topic
Um,
for a future
right.
podcast.
I'd love to have that proof. I'd love to be able to, have a buddy that's doing gene testing. I'd love to be able to do pre and post gene testing after treating stealth pathogens and, viruses that can create this thing. That would
Yeah.
be awesome.
Well, if ever there was a talk that we've had that I think that could use some questions clarified, I'm sure that we didn't answer everything that three people needed. Please leave it in a comment below. Make sure that we're clarifying for this for you. But at the end of it all, we really hope we've just empowered you with some things you can do, taking you out of
Right.
that case of where you think your whole life is going to be a mess because you've got one little genetic marker that you tested for, and then you have to supplement for the rest of your life. We don't believe that's true. We think there's more you can do when it comes to that, and there's more you can learn from about that for yourself. But
100%.
any last thoughts, Dr. B?
Oh, I mean, I'm the headache guy, right? So
Yeah, go for it.
bitemporal headaches could be a sign that you're not methylating, you're not breaking down that estrogen properly. So it's going to manifest as a temple in both sides. So there's a big one. Betaine is another one I forgot to mention, but that's
Yep,
another very common nutrient to drive methylation pathway.
right,
Betaine means that's to make stomach acid. So if you have a left-sided headache, that could be potentially a sign that you're missing one of the nutrients to drive methylation, it'd be called betaine or stomach acid ultimately. So
right.
those are a couple little, pearls from a headache perspective as you decide whether or not and we already know that you need the Headache Advantage book. So
Yeah. That's
shameless plug.
right. You want to know what glucuronidation is? Read the book.
Yeah, it's in there.
All right. Well, thank you all for watching. We appreciate you being here with us. And again, anything that we can do to answer questions, any ideas coming up, we've got a list of things coming, but we want to make sure we're keeping them in the category that you're asking about. So,
Right. Be empowered to
watching.
make good choices.
That's right. And you all have a great week.